of you who are going, what did my church do with my worship songs this morning? Don't worry, you're going to get plenty of opportunity to worship after this message, because I think that the message today is going to lead to a response of worship out of our hearts. And so we're flipping the service around a little bit. Sorry to mess with your mojo, sorry to sort of change everything up on you a little bit, but every now and then a little bit of change isn't a bad thing. Well, guys, I want to open up with a story this morning. When I was growing up, my mom had this very special hutch that was in our kitchen. So in our kitchen was like a lot of American home kitchens. We had cabinets that were, around our kitchen, and in those cabinets were all the common bowls and the common plates, and in the cabinet drawers were the common fake silverware, not the real stuff. It was all the common stuff that you'd use all year long. But in this hutch that was pushed off to the side of our kitchen, my mom had her fine china in that. I don't know if any of you had fine china in your home, or maybe you have some now. Fine china is just an excuse to have plates that you look at all year long, okay? And so we had very special rules in our house around the fine china. All right, rule number one is you did not run near the hutch, because you might tip the hutch over and ruin the fine china, in which case it would ruin your childhood when you were dead. So you could not run near the fine china. Rule number two was that the fine china only came out once a year. So at best, once a year. So all year long, you would use the common bowls and the common plates and the common silverware. But at Thanksgiving, if you were having all the family in town, now you would use the fine china, and you would set the table up with it, and the special serving bowls and the special plates and the true silverware, the kind of stuff you could go, cash out on, real value to it. And so it was once a year that you got to use the fine china. That fine china was set apart for a very special purpose and a very special use. It had a specific purpose in our home, and it wasn't meant to be intermixed with everything that was common. Now, in your world, you probably have some things that are set apart. So maybe, for example, maybe you've got a wedding album from your wedding, and that thing is set apart. Like, that doesn't go where any other picture would go. That thing is high up on a shelf where no little hands could ever get it and could ever run with it. And there's special rules around when it's allowed to be opened and looked at and who's allowed to touch it, because it's so important. It has so much value. It's a series of pictures that are set apart. Maybe at some point in your life you've had some disposable income, and you were able to buy a car that was a fun car, a toy car, not one that was just the common car you would drive to work. This was the car that was set in the other stall in the garage that was only for special purposes. I've never had that kind of disposable income in my life. Some of you have. But if you have, you had something that was set apart. It was different. It had a unique and special purpose to it. Well, I share that with you because we come to a place in the Bible today where what we see God doing is He is taking this nation, the Israelites, and that's exactly what He's doing with Israel. He is setting Israel apart and intentionally separating them from all the common nations around them, because the nation of Israel was going to have an enormous purpose in His grand plan of bringing the whole world into relationship with Himself. So He needed Israel to be different. He needed them to be separate. He needed them to have their own special set of rules that applied just to them, so they could be different and prepare the way for what God was going to do. So today we're starting a brand new series, or you could think of it more as a mini-series. It's called The Story Set Apart. So what we're doing all year long, as many of you know, we are going through the entire Bible cover to cover. We're using the Storybook Bible and meeting in small groups and discussing what we're learning here on Sundays. And so the goal is to go through the whole Bible cover to cover, but we're breaking this whole thing down. You could think of them in a mini-series. And so our first mini-series was this, we called it The Story in the Beginning. And it was all the opening stories in the Bible, the major opening stories that set the table for everything that was going to happen in the Bible. And now we come to a new block of 4 messages, and we're calling it Set Apart, because these next 4 messages are all about God setting Israel in a unique position to do what He wanted them to do in His world. And so over these next 4 messages, we're going to see God give Israel a special set of laws. We're going to see Him give them a special block of land that was just theirs that they were supposed to take. We're going to see God raise up for them leaders who are not like the leaders of other nations. They're not like the kings of other nations. They're called the judges, who God would commune with the judge, and the judge would lead the nation. So everything God was doing in these next 4 messages are setting Israel apart for very, very special service. And so today, we come to the beginning of this, where God begins to set them apart, and it all starts in Exodus chapter 19. And so what's happening here is that Israel has now been totally delivered from Egypt. Egypt is in the past. Okay, they had been in slavery for hundreds of years, and now Israel is on the other side of the Red Sea. They have only been set free from slavery for 3 months at this point, just for 3. So they've had hundreds of years of slavery, 3 months of freedom. They have no idea how to use their new freedom. This is totally foreign to them. And so God invites Moses, the leader of Israel, to climb a mountain and to come spend some time with him. It's called Mount Sinai. And Moses is going to go up this mountain, and God is going to commune with him, and God is going to download on him his plan to set Israel apart from all the other nations around them. And so we pick up the scene in Exodus chapter 19, and it says this. It says, "Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, 'This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and to what you are to tell the people of Israel.'" So Moses here is about to get a whole bunch of things that God is going to say to him. His job is to go down the mountain, tell all the people about it, and they are going to now be set apart when he does. Verse 4, it says this. So here's what God says to say to them. "You yourselves have seen what I did in Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and you keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, says the Lord, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And these are the words, Moses, that you're supposed to speak to the Israelites. All right. So God is, what he's doing here in Exodus 19 with this new nation that has just found their freedom, is he's showing them how special and important they are going to be to him, and how they are going to have a completely different purpose than all the common nations around them. So all the common nations had some things that were distinct about them. They did not worship the Lord. They didn't love God. They committed all kinds of sins. They worshipped just a pantheon of gods, all kinds of gods and goddesses they would worship. They would sometimes sacrifice their children or people to those gods. They were wicked and evil in every kind of way. And God said, Israel, you're going to be different. And so what he does here is he reveals his 3 major priorities for Israel that are going to set them apart from every other nation around them. And so God kind of like, he shows his cards here on what his desires are for this nation. And so God had 3 big priorities. His 3 big priorities were relationship, priesthood, and holiness. Now let me explain that to you. What we see God doing first is he's communing in relationship at the top of a mountain with Moses. So God is showing that he doesn't want to be just a totally distant God. Even though his power and his glory and his authority is so far beyond human understanding and human comprehension. His glory is so great that if a human being was to be in his presence, that human being would die just from the glory of the Lord. God still wants to be in relationship. And so he's showing that by communing with Moses. He's talking out of a cloud to Moses on the top of a mountain. And he doesn't want Moses to be the only one who has some relationship with him. He wants the entire nation to have a relationship with him. So what he says to him in this passage in Exodus 19, he said, Israel, if you will obey me, then here's what's going to happen. You are going to become a nation of priests. So think of a priest for a second, right? So think of that. Like a priest is a person, who maybe communes with God. They have a relationship with God. Maybe they're so close to God that they can intercede on behalf of other people. They can pray to the Lord on behalf of other people. Like think of let's say the Catholic thinking of what a priest is. A priest is somebody you would confess your sins to, and they would take your sins to the Lord and help you to be forgiven of those sins. So just think of that for just a second, what God is saying here. He's saying, I want the nation of people to be so close to me. They would all be like priests. Every single one of them. It won't just be Moses who's in relationship with me. It won't just be Moses who knows my voice. It won't just be Moses who can commune with me in some way. I want the entire nation to be like this. And then he says, here's what else I want. I want you to be a holy nation. So you are not going to be like all of the other nations around you who do all of these other wicked things. You are going to be set apart. You are going to be holy. So God is just revealing what his desires are and what his plan is. And so Moses stays up on Mount Sinai for 3 days. And what happens is we have this big block of text in the book of Exodus, the second book of our Old Testament, where we learn what God spoke to Moses in that 3-day block of time. And so what God does now is after he reveals his priorities, relationship, priesthood, holiness, the very next thing he does is he starts to give a special set of laws that are only going to apply to Israel. They are not laws that are going to apply to everybody else, all the common nations around them. They're only going to apply to this group of people. And so the laws begin with the 10 Commandments. So up to this point, God had only given Israel one law. He had given them the Passover law, which I read to you last week when Israel was getting ready to be delivered from Egypt. They got their very first law on how to celebrate the Passover ceremony. They didn't have any other laws yet. So the next 10 laws that God gives are on Mount Sinai in this 3-day block of time. It's the 10 Commandments. And these laws were meant to totally distinguish Israel from everybody else. So they were laws like, you shall not worship any other gods. There should be no other gods before me. I, the Lord, am your only God. Laws like don't you make an image of any other god. Don't create anything that looks like a god that might tempt you to worship it. Don't do that. Things like take a day, a Sabbath day, and keep it holy, set it aside as a special day where you don't do any work and it's just a day for me. And then it was very practical things like honor your parents. Don't murder. That's a pretty good law, right? Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't look at everything your neighbor has and want everything that your neighbor has in jealousy. Don't let your heart become just jealous of everything that your neighbor has in his possession. And so these 10 Commandments became the foundational governing law that was going to set Israel apart from everybody else. They were going to be set to the side for special purposes. Well, then God keeps going. And he goes beyond the 10 Commandments. He starts unpacking all these other laws. And it starts getting into laws like how to treat your neighbor, how to love a foreigner. And eventually he's going to give them laws on how to worship him. And what will happen eventually is that God will keep going with the laws. And so what we get in our Old Testament are 3.5 books of laws. It is the most difficult part of the Bible to read. And this is why people struggle to read through their Bibles, because what we do is we go to the beginning of the Bible, like you would with any book, and you start in Genesis, and Genesis is fun to read. And then you get into Exodus, and half of Exodus is even more fun to read. And then you get to Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, and it ain't fun for 3.5 chapters anymore. For 3.5 books, because you got to go through the whole book of Leviticus and the whole book of Numbers and the whole book of Deuteronomy, where all of these laws are being unpacked. And if you've ever tried to read your Bible cover to cover, man, you've earned your crown in heaven for making it through those 3.5 books. But most of you probably got stopped, and about halfway through Leviticus were like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And we don't understand why it's all there. The reason why it's all there is because Israel had to be distinct. They had a special plan that was not the plan of every other nation. And so God starts downloading this all on Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. Well, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, he comes down to the foot of the mountain, and he starts to give the laws, the initial ones that God had given him, up on Mount Sinai. He starts to give them to the people. So he comes down to the people, he gives them the 10 Commandments. He teaches them not to worship any other God besides the Lord. Teaches them not to make an image of any other God. Teaches them to honor their parents. Teaches them not to kill one another out of their anger. Teaches them not to steal from one another. Teaches the foundation of all this to these people that's going to make them so different. So while Moses is teaching, God invites him back up on the mountain again. And this time, Moses is going to go up there not for 3 days. He's going to go up there for 40 days. So he's going to be up there for nearly 6 weeks, like 5.5 weeks he's going to be up on this mountain with God. And God is going to start to download tons and tons and tons of rules and laws that are going to govern the people. And the goal is for God to write all of this law on stone tablets, where Moses would bring these stone tablets down from Mount Sinai and give them to the people, because there was so much law that nobody was going to be able to remember it all. So they were going to have it on stone tablets to be able to remember what they were called by the Lord to do. So Moses goes back up the mountain a second time. He's already given them the 10 Commandments now. And he communes with the Lord, and now he's in the presence of the Lord for 40 days. He gets so close to God in these 40 days that Moses he'll start to radiate and glow because of being in the presence of the Lord. His physical appearance is going to change because of being in the presence of a God who loves him and a God who changes him. And God is giving him all kinds of laws are being unpacked for him. And while he's up there, God says to him, "Hey, Moses, we have a huge problem. We have a huge problem. Because down on the valley floor at the base of the mountain, the people are beginning to disobey me." Here's what happened down on the valley floor while Moses was up on that mountain for 40 days. Chapter 32 of Exodus says this. It says, "When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and they said, 'Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him.'" You want to know why pastors don't take much vacation time? As for that pastor who used to teach us, we don't know what happened to him. Let's do what we want to do. I'm just kidding. You guys would never do that. But you get the idea. Moses has been gone. He's been gone maybe 5 weeks at this point. He's been up communing with God, receiving the law. And so now what's happened is the nation, who, by the way, has just been given the 10 Commandments. They have just been given the 10 Commandments. And they can't even make it 40 days without falling apart. They can't even make it through 5 weeks. They have just been told, no gods before the Lord. They have just been told, don't make an image of any other god. Don't do that. And now they're going to Aaron. And they're demanding that Aaron give them new gods, because apparently the God that led them out of Israel through 10 plagues and went in front of them in a pillar of cloud and split the Red Sea, apparently that God wasn't good enough. And so this is what they tell Aaron to do. Give us gods. And so Aaron, the brother of Moses, makes a gigantic mistake here. Aaron answered them, "Okay, take off your gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing them, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings, and they brought them to Aaron. And he took what they handed them, and he made it into an idol that was cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And here's what these people did. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This is the God who did it. I have an artist rendition here of what somebody thinks this may have looked like at some point in history. And can you imagine, these people have seen the Lord deliver them. I mean, they are 3 months, now 4 months removed from Egypt. Every one of them experienced the 10 plagues that crushed Egypt. Every one of them experienced the cloud of fire. Every one of them experienced the splitting of the Red Sea. And now they're going to say that this is their God? They can't even make it 40 days without falling apart. And what's going to happen here now throughout the rest of the Old Testament is going to go on for 1,400 years from this point. It's going to be 1,400 years of history that's going to pass, all these stories that we read in the Old Testament, before we get to Jesus being sent into the world. And so during that long run of time, during those 14 centuries, what is now going to happen is that over and over and over again, God is going to set Israel apart. Israel is going to fall apart with their rebellion against God. They are not going to live into the laws that God had given them that were meant to make them special. God is going to have to bring his hand of punishment upon them. They're going to repent of what they've done because of their punishment, and they're going to be set back apart again. And then a little bit of time is going to go by, and then they're going to fall apart again. And then God's going to have to punish again. And then God's going to restore again. And this is going to go on. This cycle will go on for 1,400 years. It'll just keep playing out in the Old Testament. And you just watch this story. This cycle is going to play out. It's going to play out in Judges, all through the book of Judges when they're finally given leaders. They'll walk in step with God with a judge for a while, then they'll fall apart. God will have to punish. God will have to restore. All through Judges. We'll get into the books of the kings eventually. And through all these different kings, some kings will lead them in a righteous direction. Some kings will lead them in a wicked direction. They'll fall apart. They won't be special. They'll be like the nations around them. And all the time, God's desire has never changed. God always had these three desires. He always had the desire of relationship. He always had the desire that it wouldn't be one man who's in relationship, it would be all the people, that all of them would be like priests. And he always had the desire that they would be a holy nation. This never changes. But Israel will keep looking to their neighbors around them and will keep saying what they have is better than what we have. So I'm going to covet what they have. What they have are kings with big, powerful armies. We want that. And eventually they're going to raise up kings for themselves. What they have are gods who govern the seasons of the year. We want those gods because we want them to bless our crops. What they have are gods who produce wealth for them. So we want those gods. And we'll sacrifice anything to those gods. And they will fall again and again. They will take on the wicked, detestable practices of their neighbors. There are times that are going to happen in history now where Israel will actually begin to take on the practice of human sacrifice that was happening with the other nations. So this nation that had been specially chosen by God, totally set apart by God, will keep running to wickedness and evil. 1,400 years. And so can you imagine being in the position of God? He hasn't created robots. He's not going to force them to serve him and love him. He wants them to choose him. He wants them to love him out of their own desire, out of a recognition of what he's done for them. And they keep not doing it again and again and again. They keep not doing it. And so God has to decide, do I just wipe them out and start over? Or do I do something else? When Moses was up on Mount Sinai and these people are creating a golden calf down in the valley, the very first thing God said to him when he first saw them violating the first and second commandment, he said, Moses, we got a problem. I'm going to destroy this nation. I'm starting all over. Moses, I will make you like Abraham. You are going to be the new founder of the nation. And Moses on Mount Sinai actually had to pray to the Lord and say, God, please don't destroy them. Please don't destroy them. And God relents from bringing his anger and his destruction because of the prayers of Moses. So don't you ever think your prayers don't matter and move the heart of God in some way. They do. God's in relationship with us. And while we don't control God at all, our prayers and our pleadings with him do matter. Moses has mattered here. They saved the nation. And so throughout history, God would have to decide, do I want to just wipe these people out because of what they're doing? Or do I keep enduring with them? And so what happens now is after 1,400 years, God finally says, okay, I've got to create another plan. Now listen to me, this is really important for you to understand. One of my goals in going through the story this year is that you would understand that the Bible is an integrated and unified story. It is. So if you don't know that, you tend to read the Bible and you get very confused and you go, it feels like all these little disjointed stories. So we got this story of Abraham over here, and this story of Moses over here, and the story of Elijah here, and this story of Jonah and the whale here, and the story of King David here, and the story of Solomon here, and then you get into the New Testament. Then there's the story of Jesus. That's a big deal. Then the story of Peter and Paul. And if you don't recognize what's happening, it can feel like it's all scattered and disjointed. My goal is that you would understand, that you would see the integration of the entire Bible cover to cover this year. The Bible is not scattershot stories. It's a unified story. And I want to show it to you. I want to give you more evidence of it today. Because God, after 1,400 years, finally said, these people can't do what I've asked them to do. They can't live up to the righteous standard. They can't be separate the way that they're supposed to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the situation into my hands, and I'm going to do for them what they could not do for themselves. And so God decides to send his son Jesus into the world. And Jesus comes into the world through a virgin birth, and Jesus is going to do what Israel was never able to do. They had thousands of years to try. They could not do it. Jesus is going to be the first one, and the only one, by the way, who lives into the law of God and lives into it perfectly and never falls and never fails and never chases the practices, the wicked practices of the people around him. In fact, Jesus, when he started his ministry, he had a very, very famous sermon early on in his ministry. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus in this sermon is going to teach a lot of things about what it means to live for the kingdom of heaven. But in the sermon, there's one really critical statement that's important for you. And I'm going to show you this integrates into everything we're learning in the Old Testament here. So Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, one verse out of the Sermon on the Mount, listen to what he said. Chapter 5 and verse 17. As he's preaching, he said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus didn't come to get rid of everything that God gave to Israel in the Old Testament, everything that was meant to set them apart. Jesus didn't come to get rid of all of that. Jesus came to fulfill that and to do what nobody could do on their own. Which means that what Jesus was able to do with his ministry as the Son of God, he was able to bring about the desires of God. So God had 3 desires, remember? Relationship, priesthood, and holiness. Those were God's 3 desires. And Jesus does the thing that allows all 3 of those things to happen. So he lives perfectly, he lives righteously, he never sins, he never falls, and because of it, he becomes qualified to go to the cross. He goes and he pays the penalty. He dies, he is crucified, he is tortured, and what happens is all of God's anger that should have been poured on Israel for their constant and consistent failings is no longer having to be poured on them, or by extension us. All of God's anger, all of his fury, all of his wrath, everything that he was angry about, that these people kept running to being like other nations, got poured on Jesus. And he took the penalty. And when he took the penalty, now there was a temple in Jerusalem at that stage of history, and there was a massive curtain in the temple that separated the Ark of the Covenant from the people. Nobody could go in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, because to go to the presence of the Ark of the Covenant would mean immediate death. You're in the presence of the glory of the Lord. And when Jesus died on that cross, that curtain ripped in two, which God was saying through the ripping of the curtain. God himself ripped the curtain in two. He was saying, people now have access to my presence. Jesus created relationship. He created the ability to be in communion and fellowship with God. He created that. But not only did he create that, he did something else. He fulfilled the other desires of God. Now, Pathway, before I read for you this next passage, my final passage of this morning, listen, I think that the response we should have to what I'm about to read should cause an overflow of worship inside of us. And so, guys, we have saved the bulk of our worship set for after today's message so that we have an opportunity to respond to what we're learning and what we're hearing. So I'm going to ask you all, could you all get up on your feet right now? Come on, everybody stand up with me. We're going to prepare our hearts for worship. So Jesus did what was required to make relationship happen, but there was something else that Jesus did. 30 years after Jesus' death, 30 years after Jesus' resurrection, Peter, who was one of the disciples, is now writing, and Peter is inviting the Christians of his day to understand the magnitude of what Christ had done for them. And Peter writes these words. This is 1 Peter chapter 2 in verse 9. Listen to what he said. He said, listen to me, here's what Jesus did for you. He said, but now, because of Christ, you are a chosen people. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You are God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you'd received mercy, you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Jesus did what we couldn't do. So come on, Pathway, let's worship together. Let's worship and praise our God and praise our King and thank him for what he's done.